study the book of Habakkuk. Good to see everybody here. It's good to have a beautiful day to be out and now to be back together. We're going to begin with prayer, and Brother Howard's going to lead us in that prayer, so let's bow.
Thank you, Heavenly Father, for being our God and our Father, for blessing us so richly, for allowing us to be in your presence, for allowing us to study your word. Bless all of us as we study, all the teachers, all the students, not only those who are assembled here, but those who are studying around the world. Bless those who cannot be here, Heavenly Father, for whatever reason. Bless them in the way that you know best. Continue to bless us and help us to always put living for you as our number one priority. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. We continue studying Habakkuk. He is part of the three minor prophets we are studying this quarter. Plenty of time to devote to each one of them since there are only three. We covered Nahum most recently. And as you can see, Habakkuk overlaps both Nahum and Zephaniah as far as we can tell from the dating. And the kings during his time included Josiah, Jehoiakim, and a little bit of the time was Zedekiah. Very close to the end of the Jewish kingdom of Judah. Things were just about to change drastically, and in fact were going to be changing in just a few years. Just by way of review, very quickly, the author Habakkuk, we remembered that in our introduction last week, that his name means to hug, to embrace, to clasp to the heart. In other words, it's a word of great affection. The Hebrew word is. We think maybe he was a Levite, a temple singer. He uses the word Selah a few times, a word that you remember from the book of Psalms. And we don't really know what it means. It had something to do with the way that things were read or played or something of musical nature, but we don't really know for sure. People don't agree what Selah means. Anyway, he used that, suggesting that maybe he was a Levite temple singer, and much of his book, especially the third chapter of Habakkuk, is in a poetic form. So he is the author. The recipients were God's people in Judah. Now, it was for everybody, but most likely it was directed especially to those who were still trying to be righteous, which was apparently the minority, because it sounds like in the book of Habakkuk the righteous minority was surrounded by the evil majority. And the majority was reflective of the way of life for most people. That was the culture that they were living in. God's people had become very, very wicked and were mistreating, taking advantage of each other in very serious ways. It was also a message for the wicked, but it was not a message of you need to repent and this won't happen. It basically was, here's what's going to happen. And the wicked could be warned, and perhaps they could change personally, but God's plan for Babylon to come and to conquer them was already going to take place. It was not a call for repentance so that the consequences might be different as far as the material within Habakkuk. The setting was the ancient Near East, as they often call it. And there, Judah was surrounded by a number of powers. I thought that was the next slide. We'll talk about those in a moment. Israel had always been surrounded by a number of countries, many of them with empires, great power. And previously, God had a number of times protected them from those who were more powerful. This time he would not, because they continually left him as far as their loyalty was concerned, even though sometimes they would come back, like we saw King Josiah there. Great reforms, great good, great righteousness. But as soon as the son got in, it went right back and even got worse. So God was going to allow Babylon to come and to take them. We're talking about the late 7th century, somewhere down around, this one says Nahum probably lived 625 to 612 there, somewhere in there. Most folks believe it was probably a little closer to 605 or so, 605 to 612, something like that. Near the time when Josiah's reform is long gone, it had become very evil, and Babylon was already threatened. They're already knocking at the doors. Remember when we studied Nahum, they'd already defeated Assyria, and they were the empire to be dealt with. So we have a chart, I think in just a moment, that's going to show some of the time frames there of what was going to happen. Surrounded by empires, the Egyptian empire was never on the same level as Babylon or Assyria, but they were a force. Then, of course, we studied the Assyrian empire out there where the red arrows are, or the top red arrow. When they were in power, Nahum said they were going down, and Babylon did take them down. Babylon a little further down there. And then some battles occurring to the north there. So that's what God's people were surrounded by. So when God looked for a nation that he decided would punish his people, it was not hard to find. Theodicy we talked about briefly last week as we were closing out. It means a justification for God. Theos meaning God, dikaios, a Greek word for justice. And how can you explain how God is a just God based on certain circumstances? In this case, Habakkuk asking questions. He was not asking questions because his faith was weak. He was asking questions because he simply did not understand. He knew God was of the nature that he was, and he knew what God would allow and not allow, and he didn't understand why God was doing things the way that he was doing them. And that's what the book, of course, is all about, questions and answers. The outline, first question, God's first answer. Second question, God's second answer. And then in the last, Habakkuk praises God, has a prayer first, and then a dedication of faith, or a declaration of faith, that no matter what God does, he was going to be loyal to him. Now here's where we were when time ran out last Wednesday. Habakkuk in the New Testament. It won't take a long time to deal with because there's only a limited number of verses there. Excuse me, allergies are, are here right now. But in the book of Habakkuk, we have Habakkuk 2 and verse 4, which is quoted 3 times, at least a portion of it is, quoted 3 times in the New Testament. Romans 1:17, Galatians 3:11, and Hebrews 10:37 and 38. The portion there that, but the just shall live by his faith. That's the portion that is quoted. So Paul uses that twice. The Hebrew writer uses it once, a quotation from the book of Habakkuk. Here's a more interesting one, perhaps, that we can talk about, and it appears in Acts 13 and verse 41. Verse 5 that we'll look at tonight. Look among the nations and watch. God is answering Habakkuk at this time, answering his question. But be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days which you would not believe, though it were told you. We'll talk about that when we get to verse 5. I don't want to get ahead of myself. But Paul in Acts chapter 13 is in Antioch of Pisidia. Remember, we had 2 Antiochs. Antioch of Syria, where the church was strong, where Paul and Barnabas were sent out on the first missionary journey. And now that's where they are. They've come to another place called Antioch, which is in today what we call Turkey. Back then on all our Bible maps, it was called Asia Minor. But Antioch of Pisidia, he comes there and he preaches to the synagogue first. You may remember this is the point at which Paul says when the Jews reject him, he said, it was necessary that I come to you first, but you have turned your backs, you've rejected it, and now I become the apostle to the Gentiles. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that was Paul's mission from there on. Synagogues were logical places to go, but no longer would it be held to, that would necessarily be the beginning place. So as Paul is preaching that lesson there in the synagogue on this particular Sabbath, he's telling the story of the Jewish people, and he quotes Habakkuk because he's going to have a dual meaning in the New Testament usage. Behold, you despisers, marvel and perish, for I work a work in your days, a work which you will by no means believe, though one were to declare it to you. Now, this had nothing to do with the conquering of Judah by Babylon. Totally different situation here. Paul was simply taking an Old Testament prophecy of what God was going to do, was going to amaze them, and he's saying to the Jews, here's something that's going to amaze you. And what he was talking about was a Messiah who was going to die on the cross. that was a work which they could not really accept or believe. That's why many of the Jews were, were not believers, because they were not prepared for the Messiah to die on the cross. They had a totally different idea of the Messiah. So that was the work which the Lord would work among them. Paul's telling them about that, which had already happened, of course. He was referring to the death of the Messiah, who was a genuine Messiah, even though many of the Jews in this particular setting here in Antioch Pisidia did not believe him, and he went to the Gentiles, and they were very, very receptive. Unfortunately, the Jews stirred things up and ran he and Barnabas out of town. So that is a quotation of Habakkuk 1 in verse 5. As we examine the text tonight, we'll get to that in just a moment. Here's part of a huge, huge scroll that was found in cave number 1 of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Remember the Dead Sea Scrolls? They were found about back in 1947 or so, the first one. Lots of exploration since then. A bunch of caves in basically a deserted place called Qumran near the Dead Sea. And we don't know everything about these folks, but they were very fond of Scripture. They made many copies of Scriptures, which were preserved well in those caves. And they lived a life that was basically set apart from the rest of people, because this was a desert place. You've seen pictures of the cave area there. You've seen pictures of that portion around the Dead Sea. The only reason you'd go there is because you wanted to live, in those conditions, in those caves, with those people. Well, here's a portion of one end of. This is called a commentary on Habakkuk. It seems that those folks were very fascinated with the first 2 chapters of Habakkuk, that they somehow brought them comfort. And so this wasn't the book of Habakkuk, but it was a commentary on the book of Habakkuk, which of course contained much of the scripture of Habakkuk. And as far as we can tell, the people there in Qumran, 1, were either there to escape persecution, or 2, they were there by choice because they wanted to be separate and apart from the world, or perhaps a combination of those 2, and devote themselves to the scriptures. So Habakkuk was apparently a very encouraging book, because Habakkuk asked God, why are you allowing this? And God answers him in the 2 questions that he asked and were answered. And apparently the folks in Qumran were very encouraged by the book of Habakkuk to at least do that with it. So that's a portion of it. I think it's about 14 feet long. I saw a picture of the whole thing, but it wouldn't fit on the slide, and you'd be able to see what it was. That's the end piece of it. Okay, now let's get into the text of Habakkuk and consider tonight, I'm hoping, chapter 1. Remember that it's not a sin to ask God questions. It is not a sin to question God. What well-known character in the Old Testament did that? Job. And if we look at some of the Psalms that were written, we find in those Psalms some people who were wondering, exactly why God was allowing certain things. So the fact that someone asks God a question does not mean that their faith is bad, that they're sinning, that something's wrong. It simply means they want to know the answers to those questions, or at least it could mean that. Now, it could be an in-your-face question, obviously, but we have examples such as Job, Habakkuk here, the attitude expressed in some of the Psalms, and it's not a matter of sin. It was a matter of trying to understand God's will more clearly. And of course, after Habakkuk was answered in these questions, and then was able to write them down for us to understand, he understood better. And that's why chapter 3 is such an encouraging chapter when Habakkuk writes that. So chapter 1 basically is Habakkuk's first question and God's first answer are contained within there, and we'll talk about those. Let's go to the text. Oh, forgot about this one. Okay, now here's the setting. Here is what was happening when Habakkuk was asking these questions to God. He was asking God, why are you letting your people be wicked like this, keep hurting and mistreating one another, as evil in Judah? Why do you let this continue? And then number 2, when he found out that Babylon was going to come, he said, God, why would you let somebody as evil as Babylon hurt your people like that? Yes, Judah's evil, but they're not as evil as Babylon, so why would you use them? So those are the 2 questions. But here's the setting. 605, the first taking away of exiles, prisoners to Babylon from Judah. 597, another taking away. But in 586 was the taking away, when Jerusalem was leveled, the temple was destroyed, and the only people left were the people that basically Babylon didn't want for prisoners, didn't want for exiles. They just left them there, the poorest of the poor of the land. So right about, just before 605, probably somewhere between 612 and 605 is when Habakkuk is telling them these things. And it's very soon to come about. We're not talking about hundreds of years later on. This prophecy was really literally right before them. Although nobody knew at that time, how amazing the Babylonian Empire was going to be, because there was still the Assyrian Empire. So that was the thing, a work of work, which was, surprised everybody. So that's kind of the timeline right there. 3 taking away of people to Babylon. And then if you remember, 3 groups led back at 3 different times as the Jerusalem, Judea was repopulated with the Jewish people who wanted to return. Okay, now the text, the burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw, O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear? Even cry out to you violence, and you will not save. We talked about this word burden in our introductory material last week, and it's a common word with a number of the prophets. It literally has 2 connotations which go together. One is, as we would think of a burden, a weight or something, a load that had to be carried. And secondly, the application of a message, an oracle, a message to be delivered. So really you put them together, and for prophecy it was a technical term that meant the verbal message, the oracle the prophet had to deliver, which was literally a load or a burden. We think about some of the things the prophet said, and we say, that could not have been fun, delivering a message like that. We can see where that was a load upon them. Even though they knew it was God's will, God called upon them to do that. So that was the burden, or the oracle, as some translations will say. Perhaps you have other words. So Habakkuk is saying, why have you not done anything about the way that your people are treating one another? This is a southern tribe, Judah and Benjamin, 2 tribes basically called Judah, that were mistreating each other. And it seems that this was not the first time that Habakkuk had cried out to him. Maybe Habakkuk was referring back to other times that he had prayed, oh Lord, do something. Do something about your people's wickedness. I cry out and you're not hearing me. When are you going to start hearing me? He had cried out to him in the past. Now, there's some debate as to whether Habakkuk had called out to him more or less as part of the community of the righteous people who were left in Judah. And that could be the case. He was speaking for them, because obviously there would have been a few, the minority who were being mistreated, taken advantage of. Or some have suggested that Habakkuk may have suffered that very thing himself. He may have been one of those righteous people that suffered a great deal, some kind of financial loss or some kind of mistreatment by the people who were evil. Or perhaps it could have been both. He was speaking both from personal experience and from observation of the people that wanted to see evil addressed by God, because they knew he was not satisfied with evil. So he's been crying out, and he cries out, as recorded here in the writings, when are you going to answer? I cry out to you violence. Now, this word violence is an interesting word. Appears about 60 times, I think, in the Old Testament. You want to learn a little Hebrew, you can take that center word right there. I'm not going to pronounce it for you because I don't know how. But it's mostly pronounced violence, or mostly translated violence in the New King James. Also wrong, cruelty, hatred, fierceness, unrighteousness, feeding on violence, being an oppressor, being false, all kinds of negative connotations. That's the kind of word it was. It's exactly the same Hebrew word that was used back in Genesis 6:11. Remember what God had somebody doing right about then? Building an ark. You know why? Because the whole world was filled with violence. Same word right here. That's what God saw among the people that he had created. And so he chose a righteous man, Noah, to build the ark and to do all the things that Noah did. But it's a powerful description of negative behavior, of evil, wicked behavior. The word violence here, and that's what Habakkuk was seeing, and he can't understand. He has faith in God. He knows that God cannot tolerate sin. He knows that God wants righteousness to prosper and wickedness to be punished, or wickedness to cease. And he can't figure out why God hasn't done anything yet. So that basically is the question that he is asking. When are you going to do something, Lord? I've cried out a number of times. People here are hurting. When are you going to take care of this? He says to God, why did you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me. He's describing the situation in Judah as he or anyone else who lived there could see it. There is strife and contention arises. So let's look at the meanings of each of those words very quickly, because when you put them together, you have a society in which none of us would want to live. What was going on in Judah? Most people apparently describe with these words. The word iniquity means literally morally objectionable behavior, trouble, sorrow, and wickedness. And all the other words up there too: deception, evil, calamity, sin, injustice, falseness, idolatry. So that is iniquity. The word trouble, labor, toil, harm, care, anxiety. It was a stressful society to live in, with all of that wickedness around you. The word plundering, violence, habit, destination, ruin, violent action, oppression. People were cheating each other. People were taking advantage of each other. We'll see in just a moment that the courts weren't doing any good as these verses continue here. And then violence. That's the same word that we talked about earlier, Genesis 6:11, a number of other places. Violence, wrong, an act of aggression, especially involved in physical context. So they weren't just taking things from each other. They were physically hurting each other. That's how much it had degenerated in Judah at that time. The word strife, a dispute, a brawl, quarrel, lawsuit, legal cases, the process of a legal case, bitter conflict, often violent dissension. So there was a lot of arguing going on. It would have been a very happy place to be around. I mean, can you imagine walking through the marketplace? That's a place that people went regularly, the marketplace. You know, they didn't have their supermarkets. They go to the marketplace. Can you imagine the atmosphere even in the marketplace if people were treating each other like this? Not at all afraid to cheat one another, not at all afraid, if necessary, maybe to throw a punch, to beat somebody up, to take advantage of them. That's the description that we have of Judah at this time. And then contention, very similar to strife, a contentious speech act, a dispute where there is strong disagreement, quarreling, scolding, strife, and contention. That's what was going on in Judah. That's why Habakkuk could look around and say, Lord, I know you're not pleased with this. When are you going to do something about it? It was that terrible. So those words, when you put them together, draw us a picture of a Judah that righteous people would not want to live in. And the ones that were there perhaps were crying out just as Habakkuk was. Perhaps he was the voice of that minority of people who were trying to do what was right and being taken advantage of. Therefore, the law is powerless and justice never goes forth. Now, when you live in a society where things are happening, where people mistreat and cheat each other, that's bad enough. When you live in a society where when you take that to the people that are supposed to address that and are there for the purposes of justice and enforcing the law, and they're powerless and there is no justice, then it truly truly is a bad situation. That's what it was. Didn't do any good to take it to court, which would suggest probably that the people who did the judging were dishonest too. And if you could bribe a judge, you could get your way. For the wicked surround the righteous, therefore perverse judgment proceeds. You see the minority picture there? The wicked surround the righteous. You were outnumbered if you were a righteous, if you were a God-fearing person. You had so many more people that did not. And as we talked about Sunday, did not play by any rules whatsoever. They took what they could get if they were strong enough or clever enough. That's what Habakkuk was asking. How long will this go on? Okay, beginning with verse 5 now, we're going to have God's answer, verses 5 through 11. Look among the nations and watch. He's talking to Habakkuk. Be utterly astounded. For I will work a work in your days which you would not believe, though it were told you. Remember, those are the words, that's the quotation that Paul gave them there to the Jews in the synagogue when he spoke in Antioch of Pisidia. You're going to be utterly astonished at what's going to happen, Habakkuk. You couldn't even imagine this. This is beyond your ability to guess what might happen. I'm going to work a work that you would not believe, even if I told you right now what it was going to be, which of course he's going to. He's going to tell Habakkuk. And that was that the Babylonians or the Chaldeans were coming. For indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans. Now, the Chaldeans were basically a name of a people that came from the area down the southern part of the area around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. If you remember, probably in school somewhere along the way, some teacher, geography or sociology or something probably told you that was the cradle of civilization right there, where the Tigris and Euphrates were in that area. Well, the Chaldeans were a people down in the southern part of that. And Babylon was really more the name of a place. And the Chaldeans came up to Babylon, and this Babylonian Empire was established, literally reestablished. There had been some Babylonian force before, many, many years, but this was the new Babylonian Empire, which was going to be so great, and it was the Chaldeans. So basically, in the Old Testament, Chaldeans and Babylonians, you're talking about the same people. It's synonymous, even though the Chaldeans came from another place, and basically, that's where they lived, that's where they dwelled, was in the Babylon area. A bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. That's the Chaldeans, or that is the Babylonians. And he was going to use this evil nation to punish his people. A nation that even though Judah had a lot of shortcomings, Babylon would excel over that very quickly. The words here are bitter and hasty. You may have terrible and dreadful, and perhaps some other words that describe the same. The first word there literally means bitter or hostile. Not the bitterness that we could taste, the physical sense, but the bitterness as in being hostile. They were that kind of people as they oppressed people, as they took over nations. And the word dreadful there literally suggests hasty. This is probably a more precise translation of the Hebrew words as far as we can tell. And it means they just marched on and they didn't think about where they were going. Didn't think about who they were killing, who they were running over. It's just like, oh, the next battle. Let's find the next nation. That's the way the Babylonian army was. That's the way their leaders were. Let's just keep on marching. Not too much for strategy, not too much for, well, we've got enough now, we better back off and protect this. It's like, where's the next fight coming from? They were hostile and they were hasty. And they were marching through the breadth of the earth. They would go as far as their resources would allow them to, taking over these places. Terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. God used Babylon wasn't because Babylon had any kind of special relationship with God or gave him any credit, for the most part, at least at this time. Now, later on, you remember the stories with Nebuchadnezzar and all of that, and he gave some credit to God, but that's an exception to the rule. So they thought it was all them. We'll see another verse in a minute that helps us to appreciate that. Here's how terrible they were, these people that were going to come upon them. Their horses are swifter than leopards and more fierce than evening wolves. Now, I tried to figure out why evening wolves were worse than midday wolves or morning wolves. The only thing I could figure, and I didn't find this anywhere, would be maybe by that time of day they hadn't got anything to eat and they were really, really desperate. Or maybe that's when they started hunting more. As things began to get dark and cool down, maybe that's when they did their hunting. That's when wolves were fierce. I don't know. But anyway, this is how the Babylonians were described. Swift horses, and as fierce as the wolves there. Their chargers charge ahead, just headlong into the battle. And of course, their enemies already knew that, and Judah was going to find that out. Their cavalry comes from afar. You can travel a lot more on horses than you can moving an army on its feet. So they were a force to be dealt with. They fly as the eagle that hastens to eat. Now, how do eagles hasten to eat? They start out up here, they spot the prey, and swoosh, right down on it. That's a picture of how quickly destruction would come. It would come upon them like the eagle that's watching this little rabbit on the ground and doesn't pay enough attention, and before you know it, in seconds, he's got the rabbit in his claws, he's flying away. By the way, a lot of folks will translate that instead of eagle, vulture, but to me that doesn't quite have the same impact. And I don't think people are sure what kind of bird that was. It may have been vultures that are talked about rather than eagles, but it makes a whole lot nicer image, doesn't it, to have an eagle swooping down like that than a vulture. And really, vultures, I think, probably do a lot less swooping than the eagles do, because what they eat is already lying there dead. But anyway, that's the attack, the swift attack that would cause your destruction. They all come for violence. And guess where that word violence is again? Same word as we read earlier in Habakkuk, same word as Genesis 6:11. The earth was filled with violence in the pre-flood days. Their faces are set like the east wind. Now, what was true about the east wind? The west wind for Judah came from where? The direction of the Mediterranean. And sometimes it would bring moisture, sometimes it would bring a cool breeze. The west wind was not particularly a bad thing. But what about the east wind? You remember even now what's to the east of Israel? A lot of desert. And so the wind that would come, the east wind, was dry and fierce and hot. That was the east wind. So the Bible uses this phrase a number of times for this imagery. That's representing something coming that you don't want to face. Nobody was excited about facing an east wind. West wind, maybe. East wind, no. Hot, dry, and strong. So Babylon was coming, and of course they were coming kind of from the east. Of course they went up to the north to come down too, as far as the traveling. But they were coming in like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. Now what's the imagery we think of when we think of sand? Abraham's generation would be like the sands of the sea, innumerable. Well, that's the image we have here. The people that Babylon captured, all the nations they took over and took back, even among the Jews, beyond counting, because there were so many of them. They gathered captives like sand. There was a multitude of them. Oh, okay. Here's a quote from Deuteronomy 28. Do you remember back in Deuteronomy 28 and 29, Moses is preparing the Israelites to cross over Jordan. He's not going to be with them. Joshua will be the leader. But when you get over there, he says, you're going to stand by Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And Mount Ebal, 6 tribes are going to shout out curses that God will put upon them if they don't obey. The other 6 tribes by Mount Gerizim are going to shout out blessings if they do obey God. It was a reminder, a powerful reminder, what blessings and cursings did as far as God was concerned, what they meant. Listen to the language here. The Lord will bring a nation against you from afar. This is Moses before crossing the Jordan, before Israel crossed the Jordan. From the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flies, a nation whose language you will not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which does not respect the elderly, nor show favor to the young. They were bitter. They were hostile. He was describing Babylon. Now, how much Moses knew exactly, precisely about this, we don't know. God gave him the message. He said, here's what's going to happen to you. If you leave God, you're going to be cursed. This was the curses that were called out for those who did not obey God. So Moses in Deuteronomy 28 is talking about exactly what Habakkuk is saying. It's here now. The curse is coming because you have put off your repentance to God. You've been evil. You've been wicked for so long that all of this is coming upon you now. Okay. They, Babylon, scoff at kings, and princes are scorned by them. They deride every stronghold, for they heap up earthen mounds and seize it. Babylon was not afraid of anybody. You know, it didn't matter if it was royalty. In fact, Zedekiah, whom they had king on the throne in Judah, when the final blow came, he was just a figurehead. Basically, they pulled the strings. They didn't care about kings. Zedekiah, remember, when the Babylon came, he tried to run with some of the royal household, and they put out the eyes of they killed his sons before his eyes, and then put out his eyes. So that was the last thing he saw. And then they took him in bronze fetters and drug him back to Babylon for exile. They didn't care about kings or rulers, authority. And strongholds, they didn't care about walls. They just built up those siege mounds. Take all the garbage up there, pile it up till you can get over the wall. You're in the city, and that's it. Because the Babylonian army was so big, so powerful. Then his mind changes and he transgresses. You may have a different translation that says something different here. There's debate about how these Hebrew words should be translated. But it's not it's not a one person. It's still referring to the Babylonians as a whole. He commits offense, ascribing this power to his God. That's the way the Babylonians looked at it. There was no relationship between them and Jehovah God. They didn't think, oh, we're doing the will of the real Jehovah God. In fact, their God was really their power. They ascribed their power to their God, but they really, we'll see in another verse in a moment, they worshiped their power, is what they did. So they transgressed, not giving God even the credit for using them, wicked nation that they were. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? Okay, this is, God has answered, Habakkuk asked the question, God has answered it, and now Habakkuk is talking back to God. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. In other words, Lord, you've always been, you always will be. I know you'll take care of things, even though he didn't understand this situation. Oh Lord, you have appointed them for judgment. Judah, and eventually Babylon. O rock, you have marked them for correction. You are of pure eyes and behold evil and cannot look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? Okay, here's the lead in to the second question. Lord, okay, I understand. You're going to take care of things. Got no doubt in your power. And you're judging Judah. But why in the world are you using somebody worse than Judah to punish them? That's what he was struggling with now. The wicked devours a person that is more righteous than he. That didn't make sense to Habakkuk. And maybe it didn't make sense to a lot of people then. Maybe some people today will say, well, I wonder why God did that. That was his second question. And we'll get more into that after we get through with chapter 1. But again, let's be sure and understand, it was not a lack of faith on Habakkuk's part. It was a lack of comprehension. He wasn't saying, God, I don't believe in you because you're doing this. He said, God, I don't understand why you're doing this, why you haven't already intervened, and why when you do, you're going to use this wicked nation called Babylon. Why do you make men like fish of the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler over them? They take up all of them with a hook. They catch them in their net. They gather them up in their drag net. Therefore, they rejoice and are glad. This is what Babylon did. Remember, we saw those pictures back when we were even talking about Assyria and Nahum. They put hooks through their lips or their cheeks or eyelids or whatever, and then drag them back to Babylon like that. Those, especially the royal people that they captured. And they also use these nets that you can see some reference to if you want to get on the internet and look at it. I couldn't find any good pictures, but they actually use nets also to capture people. In other words, Babylon treated people like animals, fish, creeping things. That's the way they treat them, which puzzled Habakkuk. Why would God use these people, allowing them to make animals out of his own people, Judah? And then when they did it, they rejoiced and they were glad. That's the way that Babylon treated people. That's what Habakkuk struggled with. And now our final verse is from chapter 1. Therefore they sacrifice to their net and they burn incense to their dragnet. Remember a while ago the association between power and their God? Well, the truth is power was their God. Power was their God. When they reconsidered a victory, when they talked about what we do well, what we do wrong, the power was in the nets, the drag nets. The power was in their weapons. The power was in what they used to conquer another people, and perhaps in their own ability to be soldiers too, but it was all about them. That's what they considered, which of course was wrong. That was their trespass. Because by them their share is sumptuous and their food plentiful. By them, by those weapons. Shall they therefore empty their net and continue to slay nations without pity? In other words, God, why don't you stop Babylon? Now, they're bad people. They treat people like animals. Not just Judah, but everybody they deal with. And they just keep going and going and they aren't stopped. Why are you using them to take Judah into exile? That's the second question. Well, we'll start up with chapter 2 next week, and we'll get with God's answer and so forth on this. Appreciate your attention.